Hello and welcome to the big debate on S3, SABC News Channel 404, YouTube and on TikTok. My name is Tembekile Mkhototo. Apartheid in South Africa was defeated by a global movement for human rights and justice. From London to New York to Gaza, people took to the streets calling for the release of Mandela. Now, it's South Africa's turn to stand up for those values right across the world. In 2024, millions of lives are threatened by war and human rights abuses, and South Africa is leading the world in taking Israel to the International Court of Justice to halt the genocide against Palestinians. But are we doing enough, and are we selective in our causes that we support as a country? Closer to home, for example, human rights activists in Southern Africa do not always enjoy our support. When it comes to BRICS, we seem willing to overlook human rights abuses and repression of political opponents in the interest of trade. As Tutu once suggested, given our history, should South Africa's international relations be based only on human rights? With me to discuss this are Shannon Ibrahim of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Samantha Hargreaves from Women African Alliance is also here. Ignacy Dumo, a Mozambican activist and researcher, also joins us, as does Philani Mthembu from International Global Dialogue and Roshan Dadu from Boycott, Divest, Sanction, that's BDS, here in South Africa. We also have John Fish Hodson from South African Jews for a Free Palestine. In the audience, we have members of the international community, activists, specialists, and the youth. Welcome to you all. Well, what then is your view? Should South Africa be more consistent in our approach to human rights? Take a look.
We charge you with genocide! Biden, you can hide! Biden, you can hide!
South Africa has traveled here today to do what it can to urgently stop the ongoing genocide.
South Africa is taking a leading role on the world stage, bringing Israel to book at the International Court of Justice for the ongoing atrocities being committed against Palestinians in their homeland. Now supported by 12 countries and counting, this unprecedented shift in global politics is arguably a big win for human rights globally.
Not a single country, not a single government in the world has dared to take on Israel. But the South African government has decided to do that.
Free Palestine!
Professor Haida Eid is a Palestinian South African, formerly based at the now destroyed Al-Aqsa University.
I spent the first 2 months of the genocide in Gaza, and during that time I was displaced 3 times, in fact. The second week of the genocide, I lost my house, I lost my neighborhood, I lost my city.
We have seen Israel increasingly become a rogue state, while Western nations, Arab nations, and even South Africa continue trade such as vital coal supplies and weapons. Should South Africa cease coal exports to Israel and help grind the murderous machine to a halt? Or are the economics and politics too complex of a matter for strict ethical guidelines? The Boycott, Divest, Sanction, or BDS movement goes beyond geopolitical trade alliances and has become one of the primary fronts for international solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Students around the world have been setting up solidarity encampments, calling for a free Palestine, a liberated world, and critically calling for divestment from Israel in all its forms.
As students, when we pay the university for an education, we are investing in our education. Therefore, we have firstly the right to know what our money goes towards, and secondly have some sort of say and control over what our money funds.
Every single solidarity activist, every single human being that still believes in human rights should boycott apartheid Israel.
Well, it's time to bring in the panel, and I'll start with you, Shannon, then BDS, boycotting, divesting, sanctioning, right out of the anti-apartheid playbook. South Africa has taken a firm stance against Israel, yet there has not been a halt in trade. Should we not be stopping local business from trading with Israel?
Well, I think that is for civil society to have its voice heard, and largely it's a political decision that Cabinet would have to make. So other than that, I can't really give a personal opinion, but definitely it's something that's been talked about within civil society circles, which are here.
So, and when we come to you then, is there true value until it's gone that far. So it's one thing to go to the ICJ, but if we're still exchanging money with the Israelis, how much weight does the country's position have?
Well, I mean, I think we can see with the ICJ ruling the flagrant disregard for that ruling by Israel. I think South Africa and the apartheid history, economic sanctions played a critical role in forcing the National Party to the negotiating table. So I think we do need to invest heavily in organizing and campaigning for economic sanctions.
And Roshan, if we stop doing business with any country accused or guilty of human rights violations all the way up to genocide, as is the allegation against Israel, you wonder how many people South Africa would have left to trade with. Is it fair to say that?
I think in this case, absolutely, we should impose a trade embargo and particularly stop selling coal. And there is a precedent. Colombia, just about 10 days ago, the president of Colombia said that he was proposing that they stopped selling coal, and they're the biggest exporters. South Africa is Israel's third biggest importer. But it's not that big a trade that we have with Israel, actually. And there are many other markets, and there's absolutely no justification for fueling a genocide. It's a very specific situation of settler colonialism, of apartheid, and of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And honestly, I think South Africa does have the political and moral responsibility, as has been said. We asked the international community for exactly the same sanctions, exactly the same economic and trade embargoes, and it had an impact. We're sitting here now today because we managed to dismantle apartheid in South Africa in support of our struggle on the ground in the country. The international community, through the anti-apartheid movements and the boycotts and the divestments and the sanctions and the effects it had on companies and governments, even ultimately the reactionary Western governments. And I think we absolutely have to be taking the same action against apartheid Israel.
So Pinali, I want to bring you in. Would it be difficult to basically impose economic sanctions on Israel, given South Africa's stance on its ongoing bombardment of Gaza?
Well, I think what's important to acknowledge is that over time, the trade relations and the economic relations with Israel have been on the decline. The reality is that with the downgrade of South Africa's embassy in Israel, and also subsequent pressure on Israel's diplomatic representation in South Africa, is that the conditions for economic cooperation have been on the decline. And so it's not that it would be difficult. Pressure has been coming from civil society. And those are also lessons, I think, from the anti-apartheid movement, because states also move as the mood of citizens shifts. So you can already see that on the South African landscape, but also globally, there has been increasing pressure on Israel as a state and on the legitimacy of its actions. And that definitely has economic implications.
So Zara, is that enough then, that there's been a decline in trade, not necessarily a boycott or economic sanctions?
I don't think just a decline would be enough. I think we also need to look at the moral responsibility that we have as a society as well. I mean, just separate from government trade, right? We have a responsibility to boycott ourselves. The boycott of companies that fund or have stakes in the Israeli apartheid occupation, right? And I mean, just when we come to trade, right, we have to look at South Africa's role. I mean, like it was mentioned earlier, when we started the ICJ case, it became a domino effect of other countries also coming out in support. So we would expect a similar reaction to a trade boycott, right? We started, even if we don't have that many stakes with Israel, that much trade with Israel, if one person or one country starts it, we can expect a similar domino effect in trade boycotting around the world. We started, other people join, and that's the economic pressure that will actually, sort of result in Israel stopping. Or
John Hodgson, Hassan, any boycotts then, would those change the situation in any material way in the Middle East at the moment, you think?
Boycotts are important, as a tool to change the situation. As you've heard from other panelists, a lot of historical cases show us that boycotts have been a part of bringing down systematic oppression, apartheid in this country, and trying to stop a genocide. And we have to do everything that we can. It's only if we take action that we encourage others to take action together, right? I sit here representing South African Jews for a free Palestine because we're not disconnected. What happens in Palestine is part of us, and what happens here is part of Palestine. And the questions about economic calculus versus what we all know we should do to change the world are mistaken, because they assume that we can live the lives we want, all of us in South Africa, if people elsewhere in the world aren't living the lives they need to live. You can't have values of freedom and democracy and liberation and justice only in one place, ever. It doesn't work, and it never has.
TK, how much of a tightrope is South Africa walking on the issue of Israel and the Palestinians? Because the Israelis, when they talk about this, even when they went to the ICJ, said all they're doing is that they're defending themselves after the attacks by Hamas on October 7th. South African government says, well, we don't condone what Hamas did in attacking southern Israel on that day in October. What we are saying, what the South African government is saying, is that you've simply gone too far, where there's been attacks targeting civilians in Gaza. So if that is the position, why aren't we seeing more beyond just the court case of the ICJ? Is it difficult to action that?
Look, I think it is rather quite difficult, and history just shows us, right? Let's take maybe something closer to the actual region, Saudi Arabia. You would think Saudi Arabia, given its history and its importance to the religion of Islam, would be the first to say, listen, we want nothing to do with Israel. Remember, that's right there in the region. If I'm not mistaken, over the last 3 years, they've actually been opening up diplomatic and also economic trades with them. So it kind of shows you that here is Saudi Arabia, very close to the issue, very close to the region. How much more for a country like South Africa? Because sometimes in these debates, I think it does get lost upon South Africa that, listen, we're not the biggest country in the world, right? There are other pressures. Now, it's easy to say, look, let's do A and B and C this. Let's put you in a situation where you're saying, I think as of 2021, the trade between South Africa and Israel was, I think, 285 million, right? But of US dollars. Yes, it's small. I think it's 0.04 of anything else. But you need to then be able to explain to a citizen in Emahleni, right? Because that's a call that people discuss that, listen, right, I'm taking this contract away based on this principle. What does that really mean? Where I think the South African government has done well, because remember, you said it is a tightrope, is that South Africa has said, listen, there's certain battles that you do need to choose. And one of them they've done better than I think most countries is to politically put pressure on Israel. Now, you can question the government to say, listen, what about the economics? But I think, as my colleague has said, it is something that comes a bit later on. But we can't just live in a world where we believe that, listen, we can just turn off the tap.
Right. So, Roshan, easier said than done then, based on what TK is saying, because even countries in the region have not fully written off Israel based on the situation in Gaza.
I think South Africa can take more action against Israel. It can stop selling coal. It's not the only market in the world, and as everyone has said, it's a small percentage of our export market, and yet it's the third biggest import market in coal for Israel. So if you're telling me there's no other countries in the world that we can export coal to, let alone the arguments around coal as one of the most polluting aspects of climate change, and the arguments around moving towards a just transition. And yes, that means getting the trade unions on board, that means workers' jobs, but it doesn't mean losing jobs. None of the exports we export would mean necessarily any detrimental impact on our economy in the case of Israel, and yet it has a big impact economically on Israel. Why? One of the reasons Israel's so keen to genocide Gaza of the Palestinian people is to get its hands on the supposed new gas fields that are found off the coast of Gaza. Israel's desperate for energy, and it needs energy to fuel the war as well, fuel the occupation, the 75 years of occupation.
Thanks, Roshan. So when we return, we will ask what role South Africa is playing to further human rights on the continent. You're watching The Big Debate. Welcome back to the big debate on international relations and human rights. South Africa is playing a key role in challenging the alleged genocide conducted or committed by Israel in Gaza. That matter is yet to be decided on by the International Court of Justice. But what about human rights closer to home? Have a look.
In Mozambique, the discovery of over $100 billion of natural gas in the north has resulted in the descent of multinational corporations, major conflict in the region, and the displacement of thousands of people. Ahmad Bakar was a fisherman.
Tuhamisha kuja mjini hapa. Baada ya kuja mjini hapa, mazingira ya mjini hapa, naona mazingira ya mjini sio mazuri kama nyumbani kule.
That gas, the intention is to export it into South Africa, and that's already been happening under Sasol. With that volume of financial investment totaling more than $1 billion, this has been accompanied by the deployment of the South African National Defence Force as part of a Rwanda-led deployment.
Is the negotiating table looking very different under BRICS leadership?
Now we have new actors, particularly Russia, India, and China, who do want poorer, more marginal global south countries playing a role in servicing and offering up their raw materials at the lowest value possible.
We have international companies trying to extract resources in African countries, creating situations of tensions and conflicts to extract resources without any kind of profits for the communities, for the government, and for the development of the countries.
Tanele Maseko is an activist from Eswatini who went into hiding after her husband was shot dead because of their fight for human rights in Africa's last remaining absolute monarch.
During the South African struggle, Swaziland was the hub for most of these leaders. South Africa is going all out using taxpayers' money, South African taxpayers' money, to go to the ICJ to engage openly. And yet, right next door to you, 4 hours drive, people are dying.
Let's speak to Egna now, who is actually from Mozambique. Egna, the situation in the north has been going on in Mozambique for years now. There was even the deployment of a regional force. South Africa participated in that. There was a peace effort. Is that enough? And do you compare the response to the way in which South Africa has actively been fighting for the rights of Palestinians, for instance?
I think it's not a good idea to compare the situation. We understand that the situation in Palestine is quite particular. We are talking about genocide, but maybe we can say that we expect more from South Africa, especially in the relation to Cabo Delgado, not only related with the deployment, but the solidarity with the situation, and try to understand, and we expect more action from South Africa.
What would more action and more solidarity look like for you?
I think solidarity, even for the South African in general, but from the government of South Africa, we expected more. I think we were expecting more from the SADC, and then we were expecting something else from South Africa, and maybe we forgot, or South Africa forgot, that they are regional power. They have responsibility not only in the context of the region, but in the context of human rights. What we are seeing related with the situation in Palestine is very important, it's very good, but we never seen something similar when we had the problems in Cabo Delgado.
And Shannon, Egna makes a good point that you can't compare the two situations, right? Both in duration and in scale. Perhaps speak to us about how the decisions around intervention, involvement in a peace effort or any other mechanism to address a conflict, how those decisions are reached by the South African government.
Well, clearly on the severity of the conflict, and we could all see what was happening after October 7th. I think we crossed a Rubicon in Gaza. Never since World War II has an entire population been starved at such a fast pace. And I really think our government did an amazing job by taking this case to the ICJ a number of times, asking for provisional measures, and we got the rulings that we wanted from the ICJ. But when we look at Africa, I think what we tried to do is not only have a military military presence on the ground. So we have a military presence in the northern part of Mozambique. We also are part of the SADC mission in the eastern Congo. And I think that is important because we have to stop the armed conflict in order to address the root causes of the conflict. But I think what we always tend to forget, for example, the eastern DRC is probably the largest amount of cases of rape of women and girls in the world. The M23 was supposed to have been disbanded in 2013, and now it's resurged. And we're trying
and they appear stronger, in fact.
And we're trying to neutralize that as a negative force, as well as the ADF and the FDLR. These are negative forces that are bringing about this instability. But we also have to tackle what is behind this conflict, which is the illegal exploitation of mineral resources. And I think that's important. And in similar way, and I think the same is said for Mozambique. So our minister has said we need to look at the root causes of what is happening in Cabo Delgado, and that is also having social economic programs to help people who are in desperate poverty.
Right.
And it is only when they can have a reason and a means by which to gain a living and income generating activities that we'll start to see a change. So our role is not only military and security related, but human security, and to offer hope to people by addressing the root causes.
Samantha, thank you. When you look at the situation in Cabo Delgado, one of the criticisms is that the region has basically stepped in to protect corporate interests, right? Because there is huge extraction. The petroleum companies are interested in that region. Is that a fair critique? And to what Shannon was saying, is South Africa striking the right balance, if you will, in assessing situations and responding appropriately, be it in Cabo Delgado, be it in Gaza, be it in the DRC, in Goma?
So I think with Cabo Delgado, I think the South African government has not stepped forward as it needs to. The reality is that Sasol has about $160 million invested in gas in Mozambique. Standard Bank has invested more than $365 million in Total Energies. And I can continue. The Development Corporation here has similarly invested. So we have to ask big questions about what is fueling the conflict in Cabo Delgado, and that is about resource extraction and who controls the wealth and the profits from that resource extraction. So we have massive multinational corporations that are involved. The only way to really stop that conflict is to stop extraction. And so that does require that critical questions are asked about how we respond to parastatals that are actually investing in gas extraction in Cabo Delgado.
Foreign policy, I see you chatting a bit. Foreign policy is not a one-size-fits-all type of thing, am I right to say? But are we striking the right notes in doing so?
Well, I'll put it this way, and this is where maybe it's going to get a bit controversial. People assume international relations and foreign rights sometimes is based on the promise of morals. If I'm not mistaken, countries that really have a thing called national interest kind of look at it, it's amoral. It's about, at the end of the day, what is your national interest in the country? Let's look at it this way, because this is how I look at the question of Mozambique, right? Now, I know you mentioned Delgado. If I'm not mistaken, the Institute of Security Studies actually showed that it was a failure of their government there to actually look after their population, right? So that's more of a service delivery issue. When escalated, and we tend to know this for sure, that when you don't look after your people in places where, let's say, war is very close, they do tend to look for extremists, right? Now, if the South African government, if I was them, the question I'd ask is, how do I help Mozambique? Not how do I come and do what we don't want countries like America to do, to come preach and say, hey, you, Frelimo, bad, 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 right? Because when the Americans do that to South Africans, we get into a hissy fit. So the question would be, how do we help the Mozambican government? Well, the first thing I'd say is, look, the issues of how you collect your tax and how you administer it, right? We've got a world-class institution in SARS. Those are the things you start doing to influence national interest. And the question of extraction, I'm not for this idea that just extraction stops it. No, the question is, it's employment, right? So what can South Africa do? What they should have done in the 90s, South Africa had a plan which was to say, how do we actually make Mozambique's gas closer to South Africa and actually create almost like a belt within SADC such that we don't even need to import oil from any other places in the world. That's what you need to start doing to do that. Because I think this idea of simply looking at it saying, look, if we stop this one thing, it's going to happen. No, South Africa, and this is why I do critique our government, the South African government has been very poor at defining what it means by a national interest. It's easy to go to human rights which are not universal, by the way, because people assume that. That's the one assumption they make. What we should have been doing is to say, how does South Africa become more, and how do I put it? It's going to offend people. South Africa's foreign policy should be more muscular in the region. She said it.
Is foreign policy ultimately, TK, down to what you were saying, national interest? And ultimately, it's a game of hypocrisy, right? Because every country chooses when to condemn and when not to condemn rights abuses.
It's a give and take in this situation. If we as if the South African government properly invested in SADC, right? And SADC also means you tell places like ZANU-PF, parties which I think are an existential threat to South Africa, that listen, we can't keep having what you've been doing because it's literally impacting on us as a society. But what we give in return, and this is where you use of state-owned entities to say, let's invest in those countries, right? But you invest in things which the population will see it would work. At the end of the day, what you don't want is, we don't want to administer an election in those countries. It should be up to those citizens to be able to do that, not South Africa.
Egna, you're from Mozambique. Does TK make a fair point about national interest, and all the other possibilities that a government like the one in Pretoria would have to weigh in its interventions, whatever they might be?
Well, I think the most important thing here is that we need to look at the national interest of South Africa and national interest of Mozambique, yes, but we also need to look at the story of Mozambique and South Africa back in the times. So we need to understand this story and try to find why we're having these struggles, why we are having this challenge now. So I think we are missing the part that Mozambique and South Africa have a bad story back in times, and we need to understand this story. So where South Africa is now related with the story we had before. We need to remember that South Africa bombed Mozambique years ago. So how we accept foreign support directly from South Africa, and how South Africa is behaving, showing that they have a real interest to support Mozambique at that time.
Do you feel South Africa owes Mozambique something because of the history?
I can't say owes, but maybe we need more from South Africa, and we need that South Africa shows real interest to support Mozambique. And maybe we are not seeing this interest from now. So we are always backing on the times, and remember that South Africa, yes, is a regional power. They have power, and maybe we need the support of South Africa, but we must remember that these people bombed us like years ago.
Egna, thank you very much for that. When we come back, we talk about the BRICS group of nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the big debate on international relations. Do we pick and choose as South Africa when to be principled in our international relations? In a moment, we'll talk about BRICS. We have placed our faith in a group of nations that we hope will help us, for example, challenge US imperialism. But will it really? We'll speak to the panel in a moment. But earlier, we're talking about the presence of the South African government in terms of diplomacy and addressing or responding to conflicts, human rights violations, and suffering. And we heard about the situation in the north of Mozambique. I want to bring in someone else who's here with us tonight from the DRC. So if I can ask you to stand up and give us a sense of how you assess South Africa's involvement in the situation back home, because at the moment there are South African soldiers involved there in the government effort to fight off the M23. In fact, more have died this week.
Well, what I would like to say about the involvement of South Africa in terms of the DRC is more what we have seen in terms of imperialism right from the beginning. And what we are trying to say here, South Africa is not an insular country in Africa. It's part of Africa. And if I may recall history, and in terms of the Congo, but it might be Mozambique, it might be Zimbabwe, and many other African countries in terms of what we dealt with as Africans for South Africa during apartheid. And this is a time where we are seeking for reciprocity in what is happening in the Congo. We must remember in the Congo, that conflict, it's a Congo-side. We are talking about genocide, but I often speak about Congo-side. We cry in silence, we die in silence. We appreciate We appreciate the efforts that South Africa has made by sending the troops in the Congo, but it requires a deeper understanding of that conflict, that is the extraction of minerals, the women that have been raped, the children that are soldiers, so that you are able to bring peace and change, not only in the Congo, but throughout Africa. We have 17 countries in Africa that are at war.
I wonder if you are able to respond to that, perhaps understand the response by the South African government to the situation in Eastern DRC.
Well, I agree with you entirely in the sense that there's so much deeper levels of problems that have to be addressed rather than just security. So we know what the M23 and the other forces are after in the Eastern DRC, and it's been that way for the last 24 years and before that even. And it's quite difficult for South Africa to impact on addressing the mineral extraction, but I think we need to have those discussions with the government in the Congo to see what can be done. And as you know, we are a part of the AU Peace and Security Council, and I think we need to work under the auspices of the African Union to address these issues holistically, so that we can have a regional approach, because we need to involve the countries in the region in finding a solution to those problems. And I do agree that sometimes we forget that the number of people who are dying in the Congo is astronomical, and we can't pretend that that perhaps the Middle East is the only place where people are dying. We also need to provide equal attention to Africa.
Philani, in terms of the expectations that some countries on the continent have of South Africa, how much of that is realistic? When you hear about the intervention some people in Mozambique are seeking from this country, what is happening in the DRC, and what our guest was saying he would like to see happening there, is it doable?
Well, it is doable. It's part of South Africa's responsibilities as an international actor. We must remember that under the apartheid government, South Africa was responsible for a lot of destruction within its immediate region. The state apparatus was used to essentially subvert the development aspirations in our immediate region. And being a larger economy, we do have a responsibility beyond our borders. And this tells you that human rights as a more holistic meaning. There is also the right to development. And so South Africa has to be engaged not only in terms of peace and security, it has to be encouraging its corporations also to be involved, but also there needs to be a set of guidelines for how corporations engage in the extraction of mineral resources.
I want to come to you then, Roshan. Let's talk about BRICS, right? South Africa is part of BRICS. Saudi Arabia, already one of the countries that have said they want to be part of this. When you look at some of the other members of BRICS, the Indian government is accused of abusing, suppressing the rights of minorities. Russia has invaded Ukraine in the last 2 years. China is accused, for example, of abusing Uyghur Muslims, for instance. What does that say about our commitment as a country to human rights at its truest, most basic form?
Well, before we get onto BRICS, going back to our own continent, if you look at all these areas that have been discussed where there are conflicts now, you'll find the hand of Israel. So I think one of the things that we can do as South Africa is continue to take this leading role, because Israel acts with its big chummy, the United States, doesn't it? If you look at the extractivism in the DRC, if you look up the mess up over the last few decades, just one name, Dan Gertler, an Israeli business tycoon that is complicit in so much corruption, so much meddling, so much interference that's fueled the conflict over initially diamonds and then moved on to other minerals. That's extractivism, where the benefit doesn't go to the people in the country, as has been said. If you look at the Sudan, they're meddling now, Israel, in the conflict in the Sudan. They tried 2 years ago to get the government to normalize relations using the UAE, talking about the wider Middle Eastern world. Why do you think they are so bothered? And why do you think everywhere an apartheid state like Israel appears in our continent, there's some kind of conflict? Oh, they're fueling repressive regimes, like in Kenya. Those police that act like a paramilitary, state police of Kenya that we saw, gunning down protesters just yesterday and the day before, they're trained by Israel, and they were originally. Also, Kenya buys weapons, it buys tear gas. We saw tear gas being sprayed in the crowd. One of the things Kenya does is purchase those kinds of repressive things from Israel. The other one is spyware. Look at the mess up in the elections in Ghana some years ago. It turned out it was Israeli spyware that was used to damage the election process. That's what they're doing in our continent, not just in South Africa.
I think
the world is connected, and just divorcing one thing from another. I think at the moment we're standing up as South Africa. We're standing up to the most powerful nations in the world,
take the point you're making,
in the
Rashan,
ICJ and in other ways, and we should do so more, because I think it will benefit not just South Africa. It's in our national interest, and it's in our continent's interest.
But I want to take the important point you made about the world being connected and bring it to you, because one of the things we've seen since the beginning of this year has been the encampments on campuses in the US, parts of the UK, Europe as well, even at Wits University. I'm not sure about the other campuses in the country. And I'm curious about what you see as the role of young activists, students actually, not necessarily activists, but people who in everyday life see violations of human rights, which they say, actually, that's unacceptable.
I mean, I think there is like a trend in the youth of actually noticing what's going on and the sort of superficial solidarity that our government shows, right? We see them intervening in Palestine, we see them intervening in DRC, we see them intervening in North Mozambique, but what are they actually addressing? Sure, they're there for peace and security, but are they actually there for the interests of the citizens? How much are we actively helping the citizens there right now? Right? Earlier it was mentioned that there's a decline because of the pressure being put on Israel, but how has that actually manifested in Israel's actions? Has it caused Israel to stop? They're still going at Gaza relentlessly, right? And that shows that, like she was saying, everything is interconnected, because the actual demons we're fighting is things like Western imperialism, is things like the traces of colonialism. That's what we are actually supposed to be fighting, but then the government turns around and do we actually fight imperialism, or do we just go there and say we're fighting peace and we're fighting for peace and security, but we don't actually fight those villains? And that's something that the youth is starting to notice, and that's why you'll see a sort of radicalization within our youth of turning against the very roots of these systems, of our systems that are simply embedded in these villains like imperialism and colonialism.
Got you. So, how do we, I'll come to you in a moment, John, how do we then, TK, prevent BRICS being a different grouping of countries that ultimately does nothing for the people, but is more self-serving for the elites in those nations, to what she was saying?
Well, look, I think that's probably the hardest thing to do, right? To be able to change institutions like that. Now, what I think makes BRICS a bit unique in that is, look, it's a lot of developing countries, right? And sometimes when we speak about the question of the national interest, look, there's three things I always just look at. I look at the national budget, I look at the proclamations of those countries. And if you look at most of the BRICS Plus now, I think that's what it's called, a lot of those countries have really done a lot of things. If you look at China, the amount of people it's taken out of poverty. Now, obviously, India as well is also going in that direction. But again, and I have to go back to this point that it's one thing for you to proclaim that you want to be able to do this, but I always want to ask South Africans who are very passionate about this is, where does that line stop where you now want to start acting such like America? Because you see, it's one thing for you to say, look, I want to be able to go tell the Chinese off that what you're doing is right and wrong. The Chinese will turn back and you say, but wait, were you not the very same country who was complaining when the US, when the ambassador was making a comment here in South Africa about what they would like to see happen in this country? So I think the best things to do is to be able to say, and I think Pilan kind of touched on it, to say, and I think she kind of puts the foot on, which is to say, how far do you want to extend South Africa's influence? Now, I'm very clear, it's a controversial point. I think South Africa should be very selfish about its interest. Our interest is SADC, right? First and foremost.
So we ignore the rest?
No, it doesn't mean you ignore, but you put the budget behind that, right? Because this is the other thing that we're missing. The reason why our reach has been so weak, look at the budget of DERCO over the last 20 years. It's been in decline, right? That means your ability to be able to go to these multilateral institutions, to be able to speak for countries like Palestine, does diminish. So if it's an old adage, if you fix your own backyard first, if we make sure that works, that gives you the power to be able to amplify your voice. And this is where I do critique the South African government, that their national interest has been very poor, and South Africa is a reluctant power in the region to take control and be able to say, hey, this is the direction that we are going.
Got you, TK. When we come back, we'll look for solutions. Stay with the big debate. Welcome back to the big debate on international relations and human rights. Should we be doing more to raise human rights issues with those we call our friends as a country? Let's hear your views as well. Remember, you can get in touch with us on social media. We also have our audience here, and we're going to try to speak to as many people as possible, just to get a sense of the temperature in the room. If I could speak to you first, ma'am, and ask you to stand up and give us your name and where you're from and your takeaway tonight.
I'm Julia Hope. I am a member of South African Jews for a Free Palestine and various youth organizations in Cape Town as well. My takeaway for tonight is that I think we need to be steadfast in our morals. I think we can't kind of dilly-dally with the notion that, we're going to find a more just solution. And, I did want to pick up on this, is that it's not that it's South Africa's turn to show the world or to support the world in a way that they did for us. We have to be showing up for our people simultaneously in a way that we still aren't, in a way that we still haven't dealt with apartheid and injustices here. And I believe very strongly that that solution can be kind of multi-pronged, and the same institutions that we're targeting is not only, whether we're targeting the coal industry because of its debilitating potentials that it could have for white supremacist Israel. It also is the only solution in South Africa for a just transition. I mean, if you speak to mining affected communities in South Africa, there is no future in which our industries are dominated by privately owned coal. We need a just transition.
Thank you. So, if I can ask you to stand up, what's your name and where are you from?
My name is Germain Kaindo Muira. I'm coming from DRC, and I've been here for so long, and I'm a member of civil society of South Africa.
And your thoughts on South Africa's handling of human rights violations across the continent and elsewhere?
It's very sad what South Africa is doing, because of when you see how they are handling first the people here in South Africa who are coming from outside. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. South Africa should do more because of the way those countries supported South Africa when they was in big trouble. They see people like refugees, they don't process anything as papers, and everything is collapsing, and so there is nothing that South Africa is doing more to people who are coming outside.
Okay, thank you, sir. John, I want to take that point, because I know you wanted to speak earlier. What the gentleman was saying, I wonder if you want to respond to that, and I want to take it and put it together with what TK was saying. For example, that one of the things you need to do is tend to your own backyard before you branch out too far. Is that a fair assessment? Given just the weight of the problems this country has domestically.
The mistake that is being made is to think that the problems we have here are divorced from the problems people have in Mozambique and in Kenya and in the DRC and elsewhere across the world, right? I have to say that my friend TK over here is fudging things, because he makes it sound like we're playing a game of you pick your conflict, you pick your friends, you choose where to get involved, you can't do everything, right? The first question is, he wants to say, let's deal with our own backyard. Whose backyard? How did this become anyone's backyard, right? Who was ever living here in the first place? Who was ever living in Palestine, all right? I'm very glad, at least, that we're talking about the continent today, because as South Africans, we have a real problem of thinking we aren't part of the rest of this continent, and not talking, as the gentleman just said, about the serious Afrophobia. It's not xenophobia, Afrophobia that goes on in this country, all right? So I want to take you, lastly, back to Kenya, which Russian was speaking about, right? Look what's happening in Kenya right now. There's a set of protests going on largely driven by youth, right? Why? Because the government is introducing taxes that make it too expensive to eat and to get around and to live. Why is the government doing that? Partly because they are not the ones. It's not William Ruto who's going to be hungry tonight and can't drive to work tomorrow. It's ordinary people in Kenya. Why? Because Kenya has vast national debt. And I want to say at this point in time that debt is borrowed partly from the West and the IMF and partly from China. They're in the same WhatsApp group on this issue, right? The point, Tembi, is that to change what happens here, we have to change things internationally. And to change things internationally, we have to change what happens here. So the idea is we need to think beyond these borders, right? And beyond these narrow notions of national interest. Because what TK is saying is not going to feed the starving South Africans tomorrow.
Okay. TK, I'll allow you to respond when we come back. Because when we return here on The Big Debate, we'll get a last word from the panel in this first part of the program. Stay with The Big Debate. Welcome back to The Big Debate on International Relations. We're nearing the end of part one of our debate. The discussion will continue, though, in the second part, which will be live on YouTube as well as Facebook, X and TikTok. Just look for The Big Debate SA. But before we wrap up, let's have a final word from the panel. And TK, I want to start with you because there was a fair amount of disagreement with what you had to say earlier about national interests and basically tending to our own backyard. Final thought.
Let me return the favor to my friend, as he was saying, that I think when you fudge the facts, the point is at least supposed to say what the person fudged, if I'm not mistaken. Now, he speaks about whose backyard is it. If I'm not mistaken, the whole debate has been centered about South Africa doing more. That tells me other countries are looking towards South Africa. So that kind of defines whose backyard we're speaking about, namely South Africa's backyard. And if you noted what I said South Africa is reluctant. Reluctant doesn't mean you walk in with an army into that country. It basically means you actually understand that, listen, what would really help a country like Mozambique, what would help Zimbabwe, is if the South African government proactively, with the private sector, came in to say, listen, how do we actually get Mozambique, how do we get Zimbabwe to actually work better so that their population can then be able to play an active role in their own independence? We're not about making you a sovereign. We're not about...
I'm going to have to ask everyone else to be more brief. We will continue in the second part. Pilani, one thought.
Well, South Africa has to implement what it's already decided on, which is basically operationalize the South African Development Partnership Agency. This will basically expand the work that South Africa is already doing through the African Renaissance Fund. It is able to put resources into addressing the root causes of development challenges within Africa. And I think it can do that through both state-led financing, including through the development finance institutions, and it can do that by also bringing in the private sector. But the state will have to regulate how the private sector and monitor how the private sector is engaged in countries that are extracting resources.
John?
There's a very important old Jewish value, which we stand on as SAJFP. The word is doikait. And it means making home wherever you find yourself with whoever lives there, wherever they've come from and wherever you've come from. Not taking people's homes. And we're not in the business of saying South Africa should be going around telling people what to do. We're in the business of saying people matter. Borders kill people. Every day from Africa to Europe, and here, and in Palestine, the notion of nonsensical borders and South Africa's borders cause harm every day. If we think about people rather than elites, if we think about people rather than governments, people all across the world need to be living.
Shannon?
What I would like to say is to look at how we were talking about BRICS and how is BRICS in our national interest. So what I wanted to point out, what is our national interest actually? And we are driven in our foreign policy by our national interest, and that is to spur economic growth, to create jobs in this country, to have a better quality of life and standard of living for South Africans. So how does that relate to BRICS? Our trade, since we've been in BRICS, has escalated absolutely exponentially. We have the new development bank, which is giving us new forms of funding without the conditionalities imposed by the IMF, which is allowing us to do projects to build infrastructure, to also trade in our local currencies, which is what we're planning to do. And we're able through, with China and Russia to have technology transfer and knowledge transfer. And these are things that we're benefiting from.
Briefly for everyone else. Igna?
No. I think I have, maybe we can reflect on this to understand how or why South Africa needs to do something more. Maybe we can try to understand why Mozambique decided to bypass South Africa and ask support to Rwanda or ask support outside the region. I think we need to start thinking about this, and then we will find the answers and try to...
Sam?
So I think the one question we really have to ask is, what do we mean by national interest? Whose national interest? In the South African context, if you look at the dominant, where power is located, it's located like everywhere in the world, in big corporations, in the economic elite. So if you were to speak to a South African here about what does development mean to you, you're going to get a very different response to what a corporate executive is going to tell you.
Gotcha.
Our national interest is the same around the world. It's international solidarity that can help us all together to challenge power, to challenge the West, to challenge imperialism. And I think if we remember the famous quote of Madiba, our freedom's incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. The apartheid regime was like this with the Israeli regime, with the apartheid regime here. And that's the problem that we have now with Mozambique. And we should be helping the Mozambique people to kick Israel out. They have a port facility in Maputo. Kick them out of the DRC and kick them out of Kenya, because that's where the problem is. And it's international solidarity amongst people that's going to bring that transformation that we all want here and in our neighbor countries and throughout the world.
Final word?
I mean, it's like I said earlier, the superficiality of South Africa's intervention, right? What are the actual root causes? Imperialism, capitalism. The West is imperialism. The elites, corporations are capitalism. We can't pair with those villains to solve the same problems they created. Human rights will never be at their interest.
Thank you. Thank you all. So, South Africa is clear. The government says it is opposed to genocide. We take our starting point from our own struggle for freedom all those decades ago, in fact, just as recently as the early 90s. And yet we seem to be selective in holding our allies to account. Are we hypocrites when it comes to international relations? As always, you decide. Part 2 of this debate continues online in a few moments. See you now. Thank you, everybody.